Good morning, everyone. Um, we're moving on to the next lecture, and the next lecture is Controlling the Edges. We're looking at the time period from 1660 to 1740. So you can see this one fits nicely into our recent exploration of the colonials or the European powers moving into the colonies. Now, with these European powers, as they move in, there's going to be some difficulty in trying to control the colonial population. And of course, things that were difficult are in terms of providing new land for those recent European immigrants, Native Americans who would eventually come into contestation with these Europeans who seek new land. So we'll get some issues of the cultures being so vastly different and looking at land and the Native Americans not really understanding the concept of personal property, which we know is a fiction, a falsehood, which could lead one directly to slavery. This concept of property is unknown to Native Americans, and we'll see the clashes of cultures that was so aptly written about developed between these groups. There also are clashes between the French, the Spanish, and the English on the North American continent, and those clashes would lead to the inevitable rise of the British as the dominant force on the continent. What we're going to do in this lecture is talk about that and offer you a theory of rebellion and class conflict so that you'll understand some idea of what revolution means for us, because our revolution, the theory of rebellion and conflict, are no different than any other revolution that ever took place any other place, except for a few things which I'll explain later on. Now, throughout human history, there have been revolts. We can go as far back as the Athenian Revolt in 508-7 BC, the Ionian Revolt 499 to 93 BC, the American, French, Russian, Islamic revolutions of recent past, the Industrial Revolution of 1775. That is a revolution. It's a revolution where we change rapidly and quickly our modes of production. These rebellions, all of them, vary according to methods, length, and motivation, but they are rebellions and revolutions nevertheless. We've had some recent rebellions and revolutions. We've had the Velvet Revolution, the White Revolution, you name it. These are recently 20th century or late 20th century or early 21st century revolutions, and they all are the same essentially. What they do is that they can, in some cases, result in major changes in society. Now, they can either have local implications, national, or world implications. The French Revolution probably had some world implications. The American Revolution certainly influenced other revolutions. The Industrial Revolution was a worldwide revolution that took hold in England and spread throughout the world. So some of them even have longer lasting consequences than others, and some take more time to reach its final climax, but nevertheless they are what they are. Aristotle believed that revolutions took place when you had a complete change from one constitution to the next. For our purposes, we moved from a Magna Carta and a set of historical and traditional ways of governing to one that is wholly developed by a constitution, our American Constitution. So we moved from not necessarily a constitutional-based government per se, with England, Great Britain, to a constitution-based system here in the United States. But the whole point is that you're moving one whole change of government, wiping out one set of laws, rules, and ideology, and taking on another form of rules and ideology. I think that's what Aristotle's message is. We can couple Aristotle's message with the writings of John Locke. And we boil them down to about four essential things. One, governments must, in order to avoid revolution, governments must avoid oppressing their subjects. I think it was Montague who once stated that when a government takes control of a population, it must make laws that take into account the culture and the climate of its people, and the people must have some modicum of satisfaction that their government will not oppress them. If those things don't happen, as Montague argued, that there might be the basis for revolution, and I think that's what Locke and Aristotle are saying here. Revolutions against oppressive rulers are almost inevitable. Security of property is essential to avoiding revolution. This would have been a little bit nebulous with Aristotle, but nevertheless with Locke we can see that how and why that would be fundamental. Temptations of power of the ruling class results in the provocation of revolution. So the ruling class, with its hubris and its power, is tempted to exercise that power against the subordinate classes within that society, and that tends to lead to class conflict and strife. So with these, you can see that, one, did the British government oppress their subjects? Was this oppressive regime in the revolution that followed inevitable? Could it have been avoided? Was there the securing of property in the revolution? Was there the taking of personal property during the revolution? Were the ruling classes tempted by power? Did they exert power, just benign power, excluding them from the military, excluding them from the rings of power and circles of power? If these things, in fact, were found evident, then I guess Locke and Aristotle might be right if we applied these terms to the American Revolution. So in terms of looking at your next assignment, you might want to consider these particular areas here. Alexis de Tocqueville stated that there are three types of the way that revolutions roll out, or three types. One is political revolutions. The next is sudden violent revolutions that transform entire societies. And then there are other revolutions that are slow and they eventually over time lead to the transformation of society. Right? So the American Revolution, was it a political revolution or was it a revolution based on class conflict? Or might you want to argue that all class conflict in terms of economics is politics? That's up to you to kind of think about and try to kind of understand. Was our revolution sudden and violent, or did it take a long time to percolate? And was it at any time, could the revolution been avoided if the British did different things? So was our revolution slow in coming to fruition, or did it take much longer? For Marxists believe that there were all kinds of different types of revolutions, and there are essentially 6 areas that I'll just glance over really quickly that you might want to think about, because I think the Russian Revolution was one of the more important revolutions of our time, and the 20th century definitely. So if you can understand just some basic parts of these going into the 21st century, or even into your own studies, they might help you. Pre-capitalist, early bourgeois, bourgeois democratic, early proletarian, and socialist revolution. I think I've gotten those down. Pre-capitalist, early bourgeois, bourgeois democratic, early proletariat, and socialist revolutions. These are the types of revolutions: the overthrowing of the pre-capitalist order for the capitalist, the early bourgeois solidification of their power, the overpowering of other classes by the bourgeois then turning and making their societies much more democratic, the pushback by the proletariat against the bourgeois, and then the entire socialist revolution bringing forth this new group of people, this nascent emerging proletariat power to power. So those would be the types of revolutions for the Marxists. Now, according to Charles Tilly, we should be able to differentiate the types of revolutions that there were. We should be able to differentiate between a coup, C-O-U-P, which typically is top-down seizure of power, but there are also many forms of this top-down seizure of power, and those could be the military taking power or people within the own government who are not part of the military. There is civil war, which we saw from 1861 to 1865. There are basic revolts, like the many slave revolts that we'll see in the Americas, and then the great revolutions that transform political and social structures. So according to Charles Tilly, that you must have some understanding of the differences in the types of revolutions and how they occur. Are they top-down? Are they bottom-up? Are they the splintering of groups into halves? Or there's just some nascent group causing revolution? Or do you have a whole total social transformation within those societies? Now I'm going to, just in brief, talk about a few of the revolutions that occurred prior to the American Revolution. And the reason why I want to do that is that you should have some idea that very early in the British colonies there was already dissent. So if we were to put on our caps and to transfer ourselves back to the early British colonial period, we probably might want to warn the British that there is rebellion that is fermenting, and that if the British don't do something about it, this rebellious streak will become so embedded in the fiber of British American society that it becomes almost just a part of the normal thinking within society to push back on authority. So we pick up in 1676 with an English gentleman named Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon comes from a fairly modestly well-off family, and he is not the firstborn son of his father, and therefore he will not inherit the property of his father. So his father sets him up with an alternative life in the American colonies. This was often done by fathers for their second-born. They would give everything to their firstborn, and then their second-born would be given an opportunity to have a job somewhere. But in order to minimize the conflict between siblings, usually the second-born was ushered off somewhere, in this case to the Americas, in order for them to get their start and not be able to come into conflict with that older sibling who received the boon of the family. Well, in the Virginia colony, Nathaniel Bacon became quite a critic of the governor, then William Berkeley, who he believed was not administering the colony to the benefit of the Virginia colonists. There was a statement that talked about Governor Berkeley that you'll find in your notes that kind of sum up what Berkeley was facing with a lot of the individuals in Virginia. The quote goes something like this: "How miserable a man is that governs a people where 6 parts of 7 at least are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed." So what this quote is trying to do is trying to look at the idea that the people in Virginia were extremely discontented, extremely poor, and indebted, and they had guns. And the rebellion itself is going to be a rebellion of about 8,000 individuals, mostly small farmers, about 6,000 indentured servants and 2,000 Africans. There's a lot of unrest and upheaval within the society. So from that standpoint, Governor Berkeley's got something on his hands here that he's got to deal with. And the things that they were rebelling against within this early Virginia colony were taxes. Mercantilism necessitated the need to pull that money back into the king's treasury. There were low tobacco prices. Farmers were struggling to get a fair price on the market for their tobacco. People believed that there was corruption in Berkeley's government, the revoking of voting rights for the poor, and there hadn't been a colonial election in about 14 years. All of this stuff directly contributed to the social unrest within the colonies. You should get your textbook out or Google or Bacon's Rebellion so you can get a sense of, in a lot more detail than what I'm giving here, exactly what was at stake. The restrictions of the Navigation Acts in 1660 helped to limit the number of different groups that the colonists could trade with, and that severely hampered their way to bring in income. So you can see there was always rebellion in these early colonies. Bacon's army grew to a sizable army, as I stated earlier, of landless poor and runaway indentured servants, both black and white. Now, these indentured servants have come over to America on contracts, and they're finding their contracted time period to be hellish. Many of them are running away. At best, you might get a master who has control of your contract that will allow you some semblance of humanity, but for many of these indentured servants, they were treated quite harshly, and oftentimes their conditions were equal to those individuals who were enslaved. Now, Bacon's rebellion ended with a number of things happening, and you can pick this up in your textbook, that the governor's mansion is burned and etc. But really, the rebellion itself amounted to the colonial administration's learning a few things about the colonialists. Number one, they began to have a growing sense that there was a whole population of both black and white poor people who presented a unified threat against the colonies. One of the strategies that will be employed by the British colonial government is the division of races to create a dependent class of workers. They could not depend on indentured servants for work, those individuals who sign a contract to work for another individual for a certain period of time, and when their contract is over, those individuals will be given what they called freedom dues, which would be typically about 5 or 6 acres of land, seed, munitions, and maybe a horse or a mule or something. The people who hired those indentured servants, who of course would get what we call a head right, which is about 50 extra acres of land. But this system began to fall apart as land became scarce. The only available land in the colonies for a good portion was land that was inhabited by Native Americans, and some of these Native American groups were hostile to the colonials, so land began to get scarce and dried up. So in order to create a permanent class of dependent workers, the colonials will look elsewhere in terms of Native American slavery and African slavery. The next rebellion is the Stono Rebellion in 1739. 1739, this rebellion took place near the Charleston River, and the casualties were about 60 slaves and about 25 dead whites. So this was a rebellion of basically slaves who are rebelling against the rapid expansion of plantation, and so this meant the importation of more slaves, the lure of freedom. So many of the slaves in South Carolina had heard about if they could escape down to Florida, they would be able to get their freedom. And then the weakening of the white population due to disease like malaria. So all of these led to the Stono Rebellion. So the Stono Rebellion itself, as you will see in your reading, is a slave rebellion propagated by the importation of more slaves and the thinking that those individuals on those plantations will never be free, the lure of possible freedom, and then the weakening of the white population due to malaria. So these are just two examples of rebellions that happen on the North American continent. And as you can see, that from these two rebellions with numbers of people dying, that there is real unrest and ferment already in the colony. So where would you suggest that came from? Do you suggest that rebellion started when people got to the colonies and realized that things were not quite what they seemed? Or did people bring with them from Europe this germ or these seeds of rebellion already fermented within them, the spirit of rebellion in them? That's something for you to think about. Now, one part of revolutions and rebellions that are essential is that you need to have some kind of firm understanding of exploitation. For us, one of the hallmarks of exploitation, or one of the areas that we kind of look at in this modern world, is economic development that leads directly to class conflict. Why? Because essentially people must work for wages. So what happened is businesses become larger through concentration and reduce the smaller businesses or eliminate them altogether, and they become much more efficient. And then you begin to see, as the Marxists argue, with this growing pre-bourgeois and bourgeois society where you get society polarized between rich and poor, and this could lead to rebellion. Now, in terms of controlling the edges, we see that the French are on the continent, and one of the things that you will see in your notes is how the French begin to exploit the North American continent, and they do this with a series of exploitative maneuvers on the continent. One of the most famous of them is Louis Joliet and Jacques Marquette, where the famous Marquette University is named after in 1673. They set down the Mississippi River. Sieur de La Salle's expedition of the Gulf of Mexico around 1682, and he would name that region Louisiana. And so we began to see that both from the north and from the south, the French began to exploit the Mississippi Valley. The French will begin at Fort Frontenac and move down all the way through Fort Niagara into Detroit, St. Joseph, and down through to St. Louis and all the way down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. And so you can see that the French are sneaking in back to the west of the British, and at some particular point these two great powers will eventually bump into each other. Now, one of the areas that I'd like you to look at and focus in on is the Navigation Acts of 1660 and 1663. And the Navigation Acts were necessitated by the British to restore trade and revenue from the colonies. Over time, the colonies had gotten used to trading with other European powers and Native Americans. And because of mercantilism, as you now know, that within a mercantilist system, those individuals cannot trade with other kingdoms, because then that money will be given to another kingdom, making them richer and depleting the amount of money in the treasury. So the Navigation Acts were a response to bring back trade into the crown. So the Navigation Acts forbid trade, to conduct trade on foreign ships. All products imported from non-English ports had to be brought to the colonies on English ships. So if you just needed to import some goods from, if you needed to import goods into the colonies, then you had to do this on British ships. All enumerated articles had to be shipped to England before other foreign ports, and then they would be transferred, and of course, onto the British ships and to the Americas. Now, the Navigation Acts themselves, there would be some contestation, because if you've been used to importing goods from the French, say, and then all of a sudden that's being stopped, then perhaps you might feel that the British are seizing in some way your property. Now, one of the things that I also would like you to take a look at just briefly are the wars that will take place on the continent. There's quite a number of them that I won't get into because you can read this. But you should be aware that there were a series of wars, and I'll just give you a couple of them really quickly. Metacom's War, 1675. King William's War, 1689 to 1697. Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. The results of these wars are, of course, increased trading, a large number of people killed, and maybe even a loosening of morality in some of these Puritan communities. So we began to see that the colonies are growing. There's contestation on the colonies. The colonials are being asked to fight in these wars. Lots of people are dying. There is social unrest. We can see this through Bacon's Rebellion, Stoner Rebellion. The indentured poor, the slaves are rebelling. So all along, and we see a growing emergent bourgeois class, a wealthy class, and a poor class of people within the colonies. So all along, the consequences of this growth, we see increased food prices, poor people dying of war. Between 1685 and 1715, 5% of the people in the Americas owned almost 50% of the wealth. So the writers were talking about during this time period that the elites were cheating and impressing their poorer neighbors. So with this, you can see that there might be some movement here for the growing social unrest in the colonies. So what we'll get during this time period between 1660 and 1715, increased European colonization, increased rebellion from poor in early America, witnessing the exploitation of working classes, and then revolutions from a theoretical standpoint, as we see them on the colonies, are taking on their own character and form. So there you have it. You can see right up to the revolution, up to 1715, we have massive social unrest in the colonies.